Welcome, everyone, to another Canada Life public webinar. My name is Carolyn Chapman, and I'm joined by my colleague, Caroline Workman. We're part of Canada Life's organizational health team. Today, October 10th, is World Mental Health Day, and our topic is the connection between mental and physical health and how to take action on it. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Canada Life's head office is in Winnipeg, the ancestral lands of Cree, Nakota, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Métis peoples, and in the heart of Treaty 1 territory, signed between the Crown and Cree and Anishinaabe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Canada Life acknowledges the harms of the past, and we respect the history, people, and land in the areas we live and operate. We are committed to building relationships and moving forward in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, guided by shared principles of respect, equality, and collaboration. If you would like to watch this presentation in French, please click on the link below to be taken to the French audio and visual. We'll be introducing our speaker in a moment, but first I'll mention that you can ask questions if you'd like. You can go to slido.com and enter CL Wellbeing in the field that says enter code here. You can ask your questions in English or French. We have a team of moderators who will review and publish the questions as they come in, so keep an eye on Slido. You can give a question a thumbs up if you're interested in it, and we'll prioritize those questions in the time that we have towards the end of today's event. Just to note, the session today is not intended to diagnose or treat. Please talk to your physician or other care providers if you are experiencing significant distress. So as I mentioned, we're talking about the connection between physical and mental health today and how they can contribute to your overall well-being. A growing body of research makes it clear that physical health and mental health are deeply connected, with studies showing that an improvement or decline in one can lead to an improvement or decline in the other. But how exactly does one influence the other? People with physical health problems can experience mental health issues, including stress, anxiety, or depression, and that affects their recovery. Similarly, mental health factors can increase the risk of developing physical problems, such as weight gain or loss, diabetes, heart disease, and sleep disorders. Here are some stats on the prevalence of chronic disease amongst Canadians. They do really speak for themselves and are pretty startling, with 87% of Canadians affected by chronic disease throughout their lifetime. When someone has one chronic disease, they often have another, or they are at a greater risk of developing other chronic diseases.
So what we want you to think about as we go through the discussion today is when you feel well, you can think more clearly. And you will feel more inclined to, for example, take actions to improve your physical and your mental health. And the decisions that you make and the actions you take today will set you up for the lifetime that you want to live tomorrow. So on that, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Mariana Bokarova, our guest speaker, who will provide her insight into the connection between physical and mental health. Dr. Bokarova is the head of marketing and communications at Teladoc Health Canada, which is a leading provider of telemedicine, mental health, and expert medical services. Dr. Bokarova teaches psychology at the University of Toronto. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto and a master's degree from Harvard University, where she researched post-traumatic stress disorder. Dr. Bokarova pursued her doctoral studies at the University of Toronto, where she researched cognitive test anxiety and the effects of experimental disclosure therapy. Currently based in Toronto, Dr. Bokarova's insights have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Daily Mail, the Sun UK, Cosmopolitan Magazine, Prevention Magazine, amongst others, and she's also a regular contributor to Psychology Today. Welcome, Mariana.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining today. So I'd like to start with a bit of an exercise, and everyone at home or at work or wherever you're watching, I'd like you to think this through. And Carolyn and Caroline, I'd like for us to maybe discuss this. So I have a picture up here on the screen, and I'd like you to tell me what it makes you feel. What do you think about this photo? What's going on here?
So for me, I think she looks like she's got a lot on her mind.
Okay.
Yeah, I think really closed off, like holding themselves close.
Holding themselves close, absolutely closed off, yes, but there's also a big dark cloud over this person's head. And so when we think about, what the state of mind might be of someone who looks like this, there's a lot going on, and they're self-soothing. And so one of the ways we know they're self-soothing is by physically touching themselves, sort of holding themselves in a bit of the fetal position. And if you ever find yourself rubbing your hands a lot, that's a physical self-soothing behavior. So we have a lot of insights just from this photo about how this person might be feeling and what's going on in their life. So stress, yes. Depression, maybe. They're trying to self-soothe. There's a lot going on. There's a dark cloud over their head. Now, I'd like you to keep this photo in mind, and I'm going to show you a different photo. So this is a bit of a contrast, but if you can take a moment, what does this photo represent to you? How does it make you feel?
I sort of think that he looks drained. Like if he's, he's on his back, can't think of anything else. He's just drained.
I think overwhelmed. Just everything's kind of all over the place. They're laying down.
Yeah, great insight. So absolutely, you have papers everywhere. This is probably someone who is at a really might be really busy, or is that, definitely a breaking point, or maybe even past the breaking point. So there's a mug full of coffee, papers everywhere, phone in hand, I'm sure getting work messages or maybe personal messages, a laptop that's open, and they're just absolutely exhausted. So overwhelmed to me is the right word to describe this. Another word that can describe this is maybe anxiety, someone who's dealing with a lot of anxiety, and they've just moved past the breaking point. So what these two images have in common is they're really stressed, or at one point they were really stressed. And when it comes to mental health, if we can, thank you, next slide, it really does start with stress. So what does that mean, starting with stress? Well, next slide, please. If we think about stress, the word itself actually it's a mechanical word that comes from engineering. So if you think of a sheet of metal that you bend and unbend and bend and unbend, what are you doing to that sheet of metal? You're literally stressing it until eventually it breaks. And so this word stress itself, interestingly, comes from a physical terminology from the field of engineering, as I mentioned, and it was applied to human beings all the way back in the 1930s by Hans Selye, who we can consider the father of stress. And what Hans Selye said was, everybody knows what stress is, and nobody knows what it is. And we'll talk a little bit today about what that actually concretely means. But if you really think about how it applies to you, if you have a colleague at work or a child at home or a parent saying, I feel really stressed, you have an idea of what they mean. But what is the nobody knows what it really means part? And we'll get into that. So Dr. Hans Selye was a physician who studied stress extensively, and he studied physical stressors on animals. So he had multiple rat studies where he physically stressed them, and I won't get into the specific procedures because some of them were quite cruel, but this was the 1930s, and animal studies were much more lax, I should say, back then. But what he realized through these studies was that the animals, through being physically stressed, had predictable responses, and that stress occurred in different stages. So he developed what was known as the general adaptation syndrome. So the general adaptation syndrome is how he categorized how these animals responded when stressed. So this is what he essentially found, that the body is hopefully generally in homeostasis. What homeostasis means is, hopefully, if you're watching this webinar, you're not too stressed yourself, and you're hopefully in a relaxed state of mind, a state of being. So your body is in homeostasis. When a stressor is encountered, so let's just say, hypothetically, a bear enters the room that you're currently in. The body first is in a bit of a shock. So there's a bit of a pause, a freeze response, and then it enters into anti-shock. So all of a sudden, your body says, we have to do something about the fact that there is a gigantic physical threat in the room with me right now. How can I act? And this is where you get the typical, fight or flight response. Freeze is also a response that is rarely talked about, but essentially right? These are all responses that are normal to physical stressors. And this is what Sally found. Now, Sally found if that physical stress was maintained. So let's say you're in a windowless, doorless room and a bear has just broken into it. You're going to be on high stress or high alert for a longer period of time. And this is when you enter what's known as the resistance stage. So your body now adapts a bit to the stressor because otherwise feeling stressed and being stressed is actually very taxing for the body, and it tries to, keep as many resources as possible. So the body is now adapting to the fact that you're constantly stressed by this big physical threat in the room. And then as time goes on, if you're unable to, cope with the stress, all of your resources are completely exhausted and you enter into an exhaustion phase. Or if the stressor is relieved, so the bear suddenly leaves your room, you're totally fine, you will go back into homeostasis. So this was Sally's general adaptation syndrome, which is really important when we think about stress and when we reflect on, what happens to us when we're stressed. And if you can think about it, a moment when you really encountered a large stressor in your life, you'll likely see that you also moved through these different stages. Now, we've talked a lot about, a physical response to stress, but what happens psychologically? So Mason, who was a different researcher, criticized Sally about 40 years after he came out with this general adaptation syndrome and the idea that humans can be stressed. And Mason said, well, hold on, Sally, and I'm paraphrasing here, hold on, Sally, you're only talking about physical stressors, but what if, what about psychological stressors? Do humans respond in the same way, or do people, not just people, do animals, including people, respond in the same way to psychological stress? So luckily, he conducted this study not on humans, but on monkeys, where he separated monkeys into two groups. Now, it's important to note that these monkeys were hungry, like they were quite starved. And in the first group, the monkeys were left alone with no food in sight. In the second group, they were also left alone with no food in sight. However, they had to watch other monkeys receive food. And what was measured at this time was their physical response to stress. And now if you can think of, which group was more stressed, well, if psychology has anything to do with it, it would obviously be the group that's watching the other monkeys be fed while they're starving. And that was exactly what Mason found in his research. So what this means to say is that psychological stress responds in the exact same way as the physical stressor of the bear. And when I say, we respond in the same way, what does that actually mean? Well, our nervous systems respond in the same way. So we have a sympathetic nervous system and we have a parasympathetic nervous system. When we're under severe stress, if it's acute, our sympathetic nervous system activates, which means our pupils dilate, our blood vessels contract to increase our blood pressure, our heart rate increases, and our digestion is reduced. And if you think about why this might be, going back to the example of the bear in the room, your pupils dilate so that you can see better. Are there any other stress, or are there any other threats to my safety that are out there? Your heart rate increases because you need to be ready to run at a moment's notice to save yourself, and you reduce your digestion because it's a resource that's not necessary at that time. So with reduced digestion, if you ever encounter a child who's frightened or a child who's very stressed, they might wet themselves. That's a perfect example of how the sympathetic nervous system acts when we're stressed. And then the parasympathetic nervous system is when we move back into the homeostasis stage where, our pupils no longer need to be dilated so they constrict, our digestion is stimulated again, and our heart rate explodes down. So all this to say, it really does start with stress. And stress is, I think often not explained. Well, back to Sally's point, right? Nobody knows what stress is. It might not be explained very well, but certainly we all know when we're experiencing it. And hopefully this helps us understand a bit more about what's going on beneath the surface.
Right. So Mariana, if you had a scenario at work that was giving you stress, and kind of in a similar fashion here, do you bring that home with you, and what does that look like? How long does that last?
Great question. So we don't generally have bears in front of us when we're at the office. We most likely have a manager who might, drop a last minute assignment on our desk. So what happens from a stress perspective when we have work stress, and do we bring that home with us? Great question. Next slide, please. The answer is we absolutely do. And this is called the stress spillover effect. So the way stress spillover works is you have, let's say you're in homeostasis, you're having a fine time at work, you enjoy the work that you're doing, you have reasonable deadlines, and all of a sudden, your colleague is out for the day, your manager comes and drops a really big assignment that's due later that night, but you also have another assignment that's due. There's a lot going on. So that work stressor is going to affect your work well-being. So all of a sudden you think, is this really, the best place? Is this really where I should be working? Maybe I don't like my boss as much as I thought I did. Maybe I don't like my colleague for, taking work off today. And so all of a sudden, the way you actually view your work changes, and that's due to stress. Now, I wish that most stress could be contained, but unfortunately, that's not the case most of the time. So you have all of this newfound stress, and it's going to spill over. If we can click the slide, thank you. It's going to spill over into your family life too. So let's say you've now worked late. You come home and let's say your spouse was supposed to make dinner, but they weren't because they're also working late. You're hungry, you're irritated, you barely finished work on time, and here you are at home. And as soon as your partner comes through the door, you might start taking it out on them. I thought it was your turn to make dinner tonight. What happened? Why didn't you order anything? Why didn't you communicate with me? I've been trying to call you. You didn't call me back. So all of these, these feelings that actually started at work are now spilling over into home, and it's going to affect family well-being because of this spillover effect. And now it's important to note that the reverse is true as well. So let's say in your family life, you've maybe, just gone through a breakup and you have a sick child at home who it's been 2 weeks and they're not getting better and they're out of school, and, the babysitter is canceled, and so on and so forth. And that will spill over to work as well, because the stress, it's very difficult for stress to be contained, and we'll get into why in a moment. But so all of those family stressors, you now bring them into work. And even if work were, a perfect environment where you have reasonable deadlines, you might find yourself constantly thinking about what's going on in your home life or in your personal life. And so you're missing deadlines now, or your work is maybe not as well received as it could be because you're not meeting certain deadlines, or the quality isn't there because you're spending so much time in a stressed state. So this spillover moves from work to family, family to work. And, if you have a partner or whoever else is in your family, their stress can spill over to you as well. So if they're having a hard time at work, that's going to affect family well-being. That could come back to you and affect work well-being as well. So unfortunately, stress, difficult to be contained, and it can spill over quite a lot.
Yeah. And how does that affect someone both physically and mentally then?
Well, let's get into it. So if we can get into the next slide, we'll talk about the toll of stress. So stress, changes our physical nature. It changes our emotional nature, the way we think, and the way we behave as well. So let's get into some concrete examples for what that looks like. From a physical perspective, and next slide, please. Thank you. If you're under even acute stress, but certainly chronic stress, something that you might have an issue with is headaches or migraines. We know that being particularly stressed is a precursor to headaches and migraines. Similarly, stomach issues. Now, if you remember back to the sympathetic nervous system, we talked about how when you're under stress, the digestive system isn't going to be working properly because your body is very resource efficient. And what that means is if you're under stress, you're not going to be digesting properly. You're going to be experiencing maybe stomach pain, diarrhea, so on and so forth. You'll also have tense muscles. And again, this is our very old brain system for fight or flight. You might have some issues sleeping. Now, sleeping is an interesting one. When we're under stress, severe stress, we could either be spending a lot of time sleeping, and that's our body just trying to not be overly exhausted. If we think back to Sally's exhaustion phase. So we're trying to recoup some of our energy, and that's why we're sleeping a ton when we're stressed. Or we have the opposite, where, we're not sleeping very much. And that's because we constantly feel like we're under threat. So this is, waking multiple times throughout the night, not being able to feel rested when you wake up in the morning, and sometimes even if you have a lot of sleep. So it's going to affect sleep. Similarly, no energy, feeling fatigue. This speaks again to the exhaustion phase of the general adaptation syndrome to stress. Excessive sweating, loss of appetite, again, back to the stomach issues, the digestive issues, feeling shortness of breath because you're constantly, feeling like you're under threat when you're stressed, and then skin breaking out as well. And this is because due to a lot of the hormonal changes that are happening. So certainly a lot of physical symptoms when it comes to feeling stressed. And by the way, I'll present a lot of different symptoms. They're not a catch-all. So you might have some symptoms that are not on this list. You might have a few symptoms on this list, and hopefully you don't, but you might have all of the symptoms on the list as well. So it's certainly not an exhaustive list, and you can really, hopefully you can resonate with a few of the symptoms to recognize them moving forward as stress symptoms. Now, there are emotional symptoms as well. So feeling irritable with others, that's, or feeling like you don't have much patience. It's because if you're under threat, you don't really have the time to sit down, have a cup of coffee with someone and really listen to them. You might get irritated because you want to move in a certain direction. This again goes back to our fight or flight response. Feeling sad, getting into a depressed mood. In fact, what we know from stress is mental illness. Stress and genetics is really a precursor to mental illness. So feeling very depressed, or, moving into a state of depression that, could be diagnosed. Certainly stress would be a precursor, and feeling depressed would be a precursor to a diagnosis, potentially of depression. Feeling resentful, shifting your moods, being sensitive, having reactions that you wouldn't normally have. A lot of times when people are under a lot of stress, they might say, and reflecting back on that time, they might say something to the effect of, I really wasn't myself. I don't know why I made those comments. I don't know why I reacted the way I did. I wasn't feeling like myself. And I think that notion speaks to the emotional symptoms of stress. Again, feeling pressured, feeling uneasy, feeling impatient. These are all signs of, or rather emotional symptoms of stress. And then feeling emotionally numb, having a loss of interest in leisure, in play, and things that you find enjoyable. These are common symptoms of stress that also mirror symptoms of depression. And so one of the reasons why you might feel emotionally numb is because you don't have the emotional capacity to even deal with your emotions. So you sort of shut off, and feeling losing interest in things that give you pleasure. That definitely can be a symptom of depression. And similarly, if you're under a lot of stress, you don't have the time, you don't have the resources to actually enjoy life, enjoy what you usually enjoy. So all of these make up emotional symptoms of stress. We also have cognitive symptoms of stress. So having difficulty with concentrating, having trouble remembering things. And again, if you really do think about stress from a perspective of when you're under stress, your body is just trying to mobilize the resources you have to get out of a situation of threat. So remembering things, not particularly necessary if you're feeling like if you're under threat, right? And so I know Caroline mentioned that I used to be a post-traumatic stress disorder researcher. We know for post-traumatic stress patients that they often have a lot of difficulty remembering things. And in fact, their hippocampus, which is the area of your brain that's responsible for long-term memory, in fact, is reduced for people with PTSD. So while stress is just a precursor, there are obviously effects on memory because it's not necessary, again, in a time of threat. Criticizing yourself is an interesting one. I think part of that is, being self-protective. You don't have the time to be positive when you're stressed. You don't have sometimes the capacity to be positive. And when you're stressed, as we just reviewed in further symptoms, and we have difficulty being positive to ourselves and nice to ourselves when we're under a lot of stress as well. Self-doubt, low self-confidence, negative self-talk. So talking to ourselves in a way that we would never talk to another person, or never, name call a friend. But somehow when we're under stress, this is a common symptom that we tend to feel. So a lot of insecurity about ourselves. And then lastly, as I mentioned, some of the symptoms of stress are behavioral. So we change how we actually behave, and decreased social connection. So if you find yourself, canceling on friends that you don't, canceling on friends, canceling activities that you normally would really enjoy doing, that might be a sign that something, you need to look into stress management, because decreased social connection not only is a symptom of stress, it's also, a symptom of depression as well. Drinking too much. So this is really like self-medicating, right? Increased tobacco use, similarly, increased caffeine. These are all behaviors that are just trying to get you through the next hour, the next day when you're particularly stressed. Acting, again, I mentioned, when people are under stress, they might say something like, I'm not sure, like I wasn't acting like myself. So acting bossy, yelling, shouting, picking fights, increased eating. We spoke about sleeping too much or too little. These are all behavioral symptoms of stress, and they can be, quite overwhelming, obviously, and quite catastrophic as well.
So these are certainly pretty significant ways that stress can impact individuals' mental and physical health, Mariana. So what can we do to help us, and those on the line here that are joining us today, be more resilient and thrive?
Thank you. What a great question. So the first thing that we can do is actually bring awareness to our own thoughts and challenge unhelpful thinking. And we'll get into what that actually looks like concretely with examples in a moment. But really thinking through, am I acting this way because it's warranted, or am I acting this way because I feel so overwhelmed? Am I sleeping too much or too little because, I've just ran a marathon and I need to recover? Or is it because I need to actually have a conversation with my boss at work and say that, these projects are really overwhelming? Similarly, am I overeating because I've just gone through a really bad breakup? Or is there something else going on there? Like, is this due to stress, or is it not? What are all of the examining our behaviors, examining our thinking, and challenging what's going on is one of the ways that we can cope. Maintaining a balanced lifestyle is another way that we can cope. So we spoke about, decreased social activity when we're feeling particularly stressed. Making sure that we actually honor those commitments if that's something that's healthy and that's something that we enjoy and we want to do. So maintaining that balance is really important. Maintaining a healthy work-life balance also particularly important. Making sure that we're eating as well as we can be, that we're drinking enough fluids, also, fundamental to managing stress. And then lastly, I would say seek support. So seeking support can mean something like speaking to a friend, speaking to a colleague, speaking to your spouse, or, someone in your network who you trust, who's a confidant, can help, but also seeking professional support. There are a ton of resources out there where you can speak to a professional. An employee family assistance program is a good example of this, where you can sort of unload your stressors with someone who's a professional and who can really help guide you to the right solutions. The right thinking styles can be monumental in helping with stress management and coping with stress as well. Should we get into some of the thinking styles?
Yes, let's do that.
Okay, so we talked about, what unhelpful thinking styles might mean when we're, stressed. Well, first of all, as the slide says, we can all be prone to distorted thinking sometimes. This happens a lot when we're under stress. So, something like all or nothing thinking, which is really black and white thinking, and looking at things in extreme is really is a distorted thinking style that can happen when we're under stress. I want you to remember, when you think of all or nothing, that there's no gray space, there's no middle ground. So you might think, if I didn't do well on this assignment, I'm a total failure. Or if you can, think back to being in school, if I fail this test, that like my life is over. So really all or nothing. There's no middle ground to think, it's okay, it was just one assignment. I need more clarification next time. I'm going to speak to a colleague and I'm going to speak to my manager so that I can get more, feedback, and it'll be better next time. But when we're under stress, this all or nothing thinking is actually quite pervasive, and it comes up a lot. Another distorted thinking, another distorted way of thinking is jumping to conclusions. And I think jumping to conclusions is something that's, more known in like popular, in the popular lexicon. So certainly many of you hopefully recognize that jumping to conclusions is really, you're making an assumption without evidence or without sufficient evidence, and you're going to always arrive at a negative conclusion. So for instance, if you message someone and they don't respond to you, the first thing you might think is, are they mad at me? Even though, maybe their phone is off, maybe they're at dinner with a friend, maybe they're, maybe they're busy with their own project at work, and so they're unable to get back to you at that time. But jumping to conclusions, a good way of thinking about it is, do I have enough evidence to actually, know that what I think is true? And am I always leading to a negative conclusion? That might mean that you're under stress, or that's a thinking, it's a way of distorted thinking that might need to be tweaked so that, you gather more evidence and don't jump to a negative conclusion. Another distorted thinking style is labeling. So attaching negative labels to yourself or to others that are based on a single action or a single characteristic. So for instance, that might mean, if you make a mistake, the first thing you think of is, I'm so stupid. Or, you maybe need to take like a half an hour break or an hour break in the middle of, an important deadline. You might start to think, gosh, I must be really lazy. Instead of seeing these as a one-time error, we label ourselves and attach, these negative thoughts to ourselves that aren't true. It's just a matter of, it was one bad example. Let's reach for the gray ground again. Another one is disqualifying the positive. So a good example of this is if a colleague comes up to you and says, you did a really great job on that presentation. Disqualifying the positive might mean you walk away thinking, they're just being nice to me. Or, what do they want? Something like that. Instead of, maybe I actually did a good job in that presentation, and, they're telling me what they think is true. And that's so lovely. But this sort of disqualifying the positive comes up quite a lot when we're under stress. Then we have the should versus must. These sorts of rigid self-imposed rules is something that, so I don't know how many of you out there know who Freud is, but one of, the foundational fathers of psychology, and certainly the founder of psychoanalysis, he had someone who really followed in psychoanalysis named Karen Horney, and she wrote a phenomenal piece on should and how this disease of the should really impacts us from a psychological perspective. So this self-imposed rule or this self-imposed expectation of what we should be doing for ourselves, or what others should be doing, is really a distorted way of thinking. So thinking something like, I should always succeed, or back to, a school example, I should always get 100% or 90% or whatever on tests, or, I should always be recognized by my colleagues. And this distorted thinking really is distorted, and it's self-imposed much of the time. And similarly with must, so holding other people to, they must be doing this, or they must treat me well, they must, recognize me. It creates unrealistic standards. And the problem with the unrealistic standards is that it leads to frustration and it leads to disappointment. So it can actually further stress, and certainly maybe even begin the cycle of stress. So This is a distorted way of thinking that, should really should be examined. Another distorted way of thinking is mental filler. So again, filter rather, focusing only on negative aspects of a situation, disregarding anything positive. So, if you receive 5 compliments and 1 criticism, you're going to dwell on that criticism instead of thinking, actually, I'm doing really well. So, I think about end of year reviews. And, if your manager says all these wonderful things about you, but there's something that they say that's negative or room for improvement, you might get stuck thinking on and dwelling on that criticism instead of looking at things more globally. So instead of, if you can take off that mental filter of negative, of only looking through the world from a negative or self-criticism perspective, and we'd be much better off. Another is, emotional reasoning. So thinking that your emotional state reflects what is real. So if you feel anxious about something, even though there's nothing to worry about, you might assume that there is something to worry about. And then we have overgeneralizing. So overgeneralizing is, again, taking one event and applying it more broadly. So not doing well on one assignment and then believing that every single assignment that you could possibly ever be given, you're not going to do well at it as well. Or, failing one test or not doing well on a test at school and then assuming that you're going to, flunk out. It's also a distorted way of thinking. Then we have magnification or minimization. So the way we can think of this is magnifying a really small mistake, getting stuck on overthinking about that mistake over and over and over again, seeing it as completely catastrophic, and simultaneously minimizing any major accomplishment as being completely insignificant because we're so focused on that on that small mistake that is catastrophic. So this, catastrophization is a pretty common distorted way of thinking. And then we also have, personalization. So if things are out of your control, so let's say you have a colleague who's in a really, really bad mood, you personalize it by thinking, gosh, I must have done something to them. I don't know if I offended them. Should I talk to them about this? When it actually might not be related whatsoever to anything you could have possibly done. And so understanding these thinking patterns can really help you identify them and, more importantly, challenge them so that you have a more realistic, more balanced way of thinking and that can lead to emotional well-being.
I think we can all, I personally can look at this list and see the way I've perhaps led with some unhealthy thinking patterns. And certainly we would love to hear how we can change or combat this type of thinking from you, Mariana.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first step, as I've said over and over, is really identify it. Be mindful about this. So notice it. Be aware of, what is the thinking style that I'm currently applying to this situation? And is it actually serving me? Is this helpful to me? If the answer is no, which if it's a distorted thinking style, the answer should be no, you have to challenge it. So think, is this something that I would actually say to my friend? Is this fact? If I called my most trusted confidant and I explained the situation to them, what would they say to me? How can I apply, that reasoning in challenging this this unhelpful way of thinking? Then you can rewrite your thoughts. So come up similar to the friend example is a really good one because we all know how we would love our best friends and how hopefully they do speak to us. So thinking about them or thinking about how a best friend would respond to us and coming up with those kinder thoughts and then applying them to ourselves is a very important step in challenging and changing these distorted thinking styles. And then being mindful. So trying to observe without judging ourselves. So without getting into a self-criticism loop, being mindful of, I wonder why I called myself stupid. Like, why did I say that to myself? Maybe I'm not going to judge myself and to call myself stupid for calling myself stupid, but I'm going to be mindful of, like, that was a really harsh thought that I had about myself. why am I having those sorts of thoughts? It's okay that I am, because that means that, my brain or body is trying to signal something to me. But really reflecting on, why am I having those thoughts? What's going on, without, being judgmental towards ourselves. And then lastly, if we're having really a lot of, trouble managing these unhealthy thinking styles, apart from obviously speaking to a professional, just distraction can help in the moment. So put on your favorite TV show, put on, a guilty pleasure movie, go out for a walk. Call a friend, speak to a friend. It doesn't even have to be about whatever you might be stressed about or about your unhealthy thinking style. You might just say, why don't you tell me what you're doing today? Tell me about, what's going on with you. Distraction can also be helpful in that moment for challenging that thinking style. So there are ways of overcoming these thinking styles.
So Mariana, you've provided some really great ways that we need to think about and how we address our mental health. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to share some practical resources to support your physical well-being, which, as we said, can have a positive impact on your mental well-being. So you can click on the resource link that is located in the event page to access these free tools and resources, or feel free to scan the QR code that's on the screen. So to start, good nutrition gives us the energy we need, and it fuels our brain as well. It can help us avoid health problems, and it helps us recover faster from if you're dealing with an injury or an illness. So we encourage you to check out this nutrition article for tips on how to, for example, increase your consumption of fruits and veggies and protein and whole grains into your diet. And the importance, Mariana, you mentioned it about drinking water, just something as simple as fluids, and how that can have a positive impact on your mental well-being as well. You can get some practical cooking tips, and there's also a nutrition log in the article that can really help you build some long-lasting healthy habits when it comes to nutrition. On each of the articles, there's also a short video. So regular exercise is also another important part, of course, of your physical and mental well-being in many ways. It can help, obviously keep your body strong, and especially as we age, really important. Boost your immune system. It helps speed recovery from an illness and injury, and it helps, from the mental health side, stabilize your mood and reduce the stress. So this article helps you learn how to start something as simple as a walking program that can help you increase your physical activity. And in the article, you'll learn on how to set a goal for walking, getting practical tips on starting that walking program, and there's even a walking log to track your progress.
Sleep is one of the most important things for your well-being. And I know we talked about it here in this discussion earlier, and I'm sure everybody knows how they feel when they don't get a good night's sleep. Stress, pain, they can make a change in the way that you're sleeping and make it hard to get a restful sleep. So this article provides tips to help you sleep better. It offers a sleep log that can help you find out how your routine and your habits might impact your sleep. And like all the articles that Caroline's already mentioned too, it contains a short video. Social connections are also an important part of our mental and physical health. So that can help us be more resilient to stress, which in turn can improve our health and sense of overall well-being. Research shows that when we feel supported, our blood pressure is lower, our hormone function is better, our immune system is stronger, and we have lower levels of inflammation. Strong social ties may even help stave off memory loss as we age, buffer against depression, and help us live longer. So consider going to events that interest you. Maybe it's a book reading or a public talk, an art walk, or a club where you can meet like-minded people. Volunteering in your community or on a committee or a fundraising campaign at work can help you build strong connections with others. And if you've been invited to something that you're interested in, say yes and go.
So in addition to focusing on your own well-being, we know that many of you in some of our past webinars have asked us about ways that you can support your friends or family members that might be perhaps isolating or struggling. So Mariana, what can you suggest individuals can do to help support their loved ones?
Thank you. So we know in resiliency research that social connection and support is really incredibly important to keep people resilient, and obviously to keep them to stave off things like depression, stress. So if you notice that, someone who you care about is not acting like themselves so much, whether or not you want to enter into a conversation is one thing. If you feel like you're equipped to do so, many of us feel like we're not equipped to do so. So there are simple ways that you can help, even if you don't have degrees in psychology. So one is just going over, sitting with them, spending time with them. If this is someone who you've noticed is starting to close themselves off quite a bit from social connection, doing something kind, like if they have a favorite cupcake or some sort of treat, just saying, I'm going to drop that off to your home. We don't have to talk. I just want you to know you have dinner waiting for you outside. Give me a call whenever you can, no pressure. So really like not obligating them to do anything, but just spending time showing that you care in even small ways can make such an incredible difference. So just sitting with someone, doing something nice, listening carefully to what they're saying is really important. So what I found is, people who are, there are different ways of reacting when you think people might be depressed. One of the ways is, oh, I don't really understand depression. Like, can you try to be happy? And that's something that, can be said with a good heart, certainly, but really lacks understanding and can actually push the person further away, because now they just feel even more misunderstood and alone. And so one way of combating that is to say, we don't have to talk about it, but if you want to, just tell me what's going on. I'm here to listen. And listening carefully without necessarily jumping in for advice and just trying to understand them can make them feel like they're actually heard and cared for. And little things like, trying to incorporate physical activity, suggesting that you go out for a walk, you go window shopping, you do some physical activity that they found enjoyable in the past could go a long way. And then just, being hopeful, like, I don't understand what you're going through, but I really, I'm here for you, or I think things will get better for you. I really do. So giving them that assurance and that confidence that things can get better. And then finally, I don't think we say this enough to people, just saying, I just want you to know I really care about you. If there's anything I can do, how can I, please let me know. How can I help? Just know I'm here for you. And I think with someone who's struggling, just those words are so monumentally important and can really make a difference in helping them challenge their negative thinking styles, particularly if one of them is, I don't think anyone cares about me. No one would care if I'm, if I'm really stressed or depressed, or if I don't come to this event. Just saying, I really care about you can make such a difference in someone's life, let alone someone's day.
Those are great suggestions. Thank you, Mariana. So now it's time to hear from you. So we've been monitoring the questions that have been coming through Slido. And again, we'll try to get to as many as we can at the top of the hour. So let's start with the first question. What do you do if your manager isn't able to relieve the stress because they're equally as stressed, if not more, and that's just how it is in the organization? I think this is a really relevant situation because we forget that managers are leaders too. So perhaps, Mariana, can you provide some insight into how we can support this situation?
Sure. So I think, there's always an opportunity to manage up. If your manager is overwhelmed and they're not able to support you, I think coming up with strategies that you can bring to them is important. So something you might want to say is, I'm really stressed because we have all these deadlines. I imagine that you're just as stressed because you're under all of this pressure and you have all these deadlines too. I was wondering if we can, implement a mental health day once a month just to take the breaks off, or are we able, like, if I've been working late these last few days, can I get some time back? Or something like even asking your manager, I've worked through lunch these last 2 weeks. I really need to have my lunch blocked off. I really need to go on a walk during my lunch hour. I'm going to be blocking my calendar. Is that okay with you? Or what I'm finding is I help, and when I take breaks throughout the day, even if it's like 5 minutes every 2 hours, it really helps with my mental health. It really helps, with my productivity too. So do you mind if I implement those things? And your manager can actually learn from you in these cases. It's difficult, right? I think with organizations, there's stress comes from a million different directions. The best thing you can do is try to manage yourself and manage the people around you, including managing up. So coming in with strategies that work for you, that you can then offer up to other people I think would be pretty helpful. And I'd be hard pressed to find a manager who would say, no, you can't, go for a walk, especially if it's going to help increase your mood and a job well done at the end of the day.
It's great suggestions. Another question is, how do you approach a friend or loved one whom seems to be at risk for burnout, but not willing to acknowledge or reach out? And today being mental health, World Mental Health Day, I think this is really fitting because it's really a time where we really need to think about how we can help not just ourselves, but like we just, kind of finished discussing how we can help others. So if there's any approach that you can recommend, Mariana.
Yeah, I think my answer is always going to be not approach with caution, but instead approach with care. So if you think that someone might be at risk of burning out, I think, if this is, did we say friend or loved one? Okay, it's a
friend or loved
approach.
one. Yeah.
Thank you.
But if you want to split them up, feel free.
No, I think I was going to say colleague, but a friend or loved one would be in a different category because you know them, personally. So I think what I would do if it were a friend or loved one who I thought was really at risk of burning out is I would, send them a message or call them on the phone and say, do you have just 15 minutes? I know you're really stressed. I know you're really busy with work. I know there's a lot going on with you. I just really need, 15 minutes. Can you do me the favor of meeting with me? And then, meet and say, I just want you to know I really care about you. And I've noticed in the last little while, you haven't, stuck to all of our plans because you've told me about, all of these work projects that are going on. What is work looking like? How are you doing? Who do you have at work that's supporting you? And then sort of just listening to what they have to say might, make them essentially acknowledge that there might actually be an issue. So I know the question said, what if they're not willing to reach out to you? If they're a friend or loved one, pick up the phone, reach out to them, do it with care and kindness, and also give them the space, right? Sometimes we're not aware of how, the quicksand that we're in until we're standing there. And obviously whoever asked this question, what a lovely question to ask, shows that you're caring and kind and you want the best for this person. That will come through if you approach it with, I really care about you. I've noticed the stuff that's going on. I'm just wondering how you're doing. I miss our friendship, or I miss, being able to see you, and I'm worried about you. I think, spoken with kindness, it can leave an impact even if they're not ready at that time to acknowledge that they're facing burnout.
Great suggestions. And just briefly, when it comes to if you had a colleague in that same circumstance, what would you do anything differently or say something different?
With a colleague, I think it's a bit different because you don't necessarily have that close personal connection. But I would probably, suggest a place not on work sites. I would say, do you have some time for a coffee break, or can we take a walk around the block, the block out of our office for our afternoon break? And then I would just say something to the effect of, I've noticed that these things are coming on. I want you to know, I really care about you as a colleague. Similar, approach with kindness. I want you to know I really care about you as a colleague. Is everything okay? Is there anything you need help with? Is there, some strategy that you'd like us to discuss to help share the workload so that you potentially you get back to being healthier and happier?
Great. Really like that. Stepping out of the office. I think that's a great suggestion.
Yeah.
Another question. When you're aware that your work performance is affected because of stress, how should you approach your employer about this?
So I think, thank you for the question, and whoever asked it. I think a question that's likely on a lot of people's mind. I would say, going back to, the suggestion earlier in this, in our discussion, is be mindful about it. So if you realized that stress is affecting your work performance, what is it about work that is affecting your performance, and is it controllable, or is it completely out of your control? So an example of this is it that you're receiving an unreasonable amount of work and it's impossible to meet your deadlines, or it's really difficult to meet your deadlines, that's something that actually is controllable, even though it might not feel like that in the moment. And it is controllable because it's a conversation you can have with your manager. It's a larger conversation you can have about workload. You can ask for help. You can ask for it to be diminished. Something that is less controllable is, if you have someone at work that is mean-spirited or a bully, or, they're really giving you a hard time and that's affecting work, I still think that's a conversation that you have, but it's a different conversation, which is, I'm not sure what's going on here, but it's causing me a lot of stress, or with this person, but it's causing me a lot of stress. Here are the examples of how I've tried to work with this person. How can I, is it possible for me to work less with them, or can we get into a situation where there's more of an understanding, where we have a more collaborative attitude, or where our manager decides, what do expectations look like? What do standards look like? What does the relationship look like with someone who's giving you grief in the workplace? So I think being mindful of what it is that's giving you stress in the workplace, and then being equipped with those, with that and potential, solutions to that. That's how I would approach your employer. Great. So basically being ready, recognizing what the stressors are and being ready for a conversation.
So we have time for one last question. Mariana, how do you maintain a balance when a stressor is heavy, persistent, and with no end in sight? How do you extricate yourself to devote time to self-care? Which I think is a great question.
Honestly, it's boundaries at the end of the day, right? So I'm not sure, and thank you for asking, whoever asked. I'm not sure what the stressor is. If I had some more detail, I could probably give you a more fulsome answer, but I would say it's just maintaining boundaries. Boundaries are really difficult for most people to create. I think especially in different areas of life, it's really difficult to say no, but they are what really can keep us healthy and happy. And so having just 30 minutes, 1 hour, something that's absolutely not unreasonable to devote to yourself, to being a better person, to being mentally better, to being physically better. That's a boundary that you have to fight both, for yourself, and with yourself to maintain. So, a strict rule might be, I'm not going to check my phone from 12 to 1. And that is a boundary, a promise I will keep to myself. And one way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to turn off my laptop. I'm going to turn off my phone, and I'll let, my loved ones and, important people know that this is what I'm doing from 12 to 1, let's just say. And then you stick to it for yourself. So maintaining that boundary for yourself is I think the right way to go about practicing self-care, even though there may be no end in sight. And I'm sorry to hear that you feel this way, and I hope that things get better.
Great. So to wrap up, that's all the time we have for questions, but just want to end by letting you know that if you are looking for information or online resources to support yourself, a colleague, a friend with respect to your own well-being at work or at home, we encourage you to check out our Workplace Strategies for Mental Health website. It is available to all Canadians at no cost, and it's in English and French, and it's compliments of Canada Life. So that's all the time we have today, and we'd really like to end by thanking Mariana for joining us. We really value the time that you spent with us to provide your insight and expertise into the connections between physical and mental well-being. We'd also like to thank you, for those of you that were able to join us, to take the time to listen, to contribute those questions. We hope it was helpful. This session will be recorded, and it will be available on the Workplace Strategies for Mental Health YouTube channel. And as I mentioned earlier, you can also visit this webinar's event page, where there's a button titled Resources that you can access the list of free resources and tools that we spoke about today, and many others. Thank you again. We hope you have a wonderful Thanksgiving weekend, and we hope to see you at our next webinar or public event in May of 2025. Thanks, everyone, and stay well.